A billionaire who'd locked his heart away, convinced love was a lie, had everything, until the nurse who saved his mother's life shattered everything he thought he knew. Alexander Stone had wealth, power, and control. But when his mother's life hung by a thread, Olivia Bennett stepped in, calm, unfazed. She did what no doctor could. And in that moment, for the first time in years, something stirred inside him, something he never expected to feel again, something that terrified him. Alexander Stone had always lived his life in a world of impeccable surfaces, where money could buy anything, but never what he truly needed. A billionaire by 35, his life was defined by his empire, his name, and the cold, hard comfort of solitude. His penthouse, perched above the city's skyline like a fortress, offered a panoramic view of the world below. Yet he never felt more distant. Inside those walls, the scent of fresh flowers, expensive leather, and carefully curated art did nothing to fill the silence that echoed within him. He had been alone for years, the kind of loneliness that clung to you even in a room full of people. Alexander wasn't a stranger to this isolation. In fact, he had sought it out. It was safer this way, a life without attachments, without the possibility of betrayal. No one could ever hurt him again, not like she had. Her name was Melissa. She had been perfect, at least. That's what he had told himself. The woman who had stood by his side in every public event, every high-profile meeting. She was everything he had ever imagined. He had believed in love once, long ago, and for a fleeting moment, he had let himself believe that she could be his forever. But forever wasn't a promise she was willing to keep. Melissa had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. She left him, not for another man, but for his best friend. The man he trusted above all others, the one person who knew his deepest fears, his insecurities, his dreams. When Alexander found out, it felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. The woman he had chosen, the woman he had planned to marry, had walked away from him and into the arms of the one person who had been by his side all along. The betrayal shattered him. From that moment on, Alexander closed off his heart. He became a master of controlling his surroundings, his emotions, and his relationships. Women came and went, famous models, socialites, business partners, each one as perfect as the last. But none of them could touch him, could reach the part of him that was still broken, still raw. He had built walls higher than any skyscraper, and he was content to let them stand. His business became his refuge, his empire a reflection of the walls he had constructed around his heart. At work, he was untouchable. He demanded perfection, and he got it. But outside of those boardrooms, there was only emptiness. His relationships with his family had begun to fray as well, though his mother, Catherine, was the only constant in his life. She was the one person he truly trusted, the one person who had always been there, even when he couldn't trust himself. As Catherine aged, though, her health began to fail. The woman who had raised him with love and dedication was now dependent on him. Watching her struggle with her health was painful, a reminder that time was slipping away. Yet, even in the face of her vulnerability, Alexander still kept his distance. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. He couldn't bear the thought of needing anyone. One cold evening, as the city lights twinkled below, Alexander stood by the window, looking out over the horizon. His thoughts were heavy, clouded with the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had built in its place. He couldn't deny that the loneliness had become a constant companion, but it was safer this way, wasn't it? And then, in the quiet of the night, the phone rang. It was the call that would change everything. But fate had other plans. It was late, the city's pulse slowed, and only the hum of neon lights and the distant echo of traffic kept the world alive. Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the skyline that stretched beneath him like an endless sea of steel and glass. It was beautiful, impressive, yet utterly empty. Much like his life, he thought. Wealth, power, influence. None of it filled the void inside him. His phone vibrated, slicing through the silence, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. His mother's name flashed there. It was odd for Catherine Stone to call at this hour. Independent, strong. She'd never been one to seek his help, especially not in the dead of night. The fear that gripped him as he answered was immediate and unshakable. Alexander, something's wrong. His mother's voice crackled through the line, sharp with panic. I don't feel well. My chest, it hurts. His heart dropped. She'd always been the one constant in his life, the one person he never doubted, the rock he could rely on. The thought of her in pain, vulnerable, shattered something inside him. Mom, I'll be there in 5 minutes, he said, his voice tight, already moving toward the door. The panic was clawing at him, but he forced himself to focus. She was strong. She could handle this. Or so he thought. The car ride was a blur, his mind racing faster than the city lights flashing past him. The tightness in his chest refused to loosen, each beat of his heart echoing in his ears. All he could think of was how much he needed her, how much he had taken her for granted. He'd spent years building his empire, but in this moment, none of that mattered. He needed his mother. He couldn't lose her. When he arrived at the hospital, everything was a blur of white coats and frantic activity. His mother was already being wheeled into the emergency room, her frail body shaking, her face pale and drawn with pain. Doctors rushed past him without a glance, absorbed in the urgency of the situation. Alexander stood frozen, his world narrowing to a single point of fear. The sterile, cold walls of the hospital pressed in on him, suffocating. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't in control. His empire, his success. It meant nothing now. The one thing he thought he could protect, his mother, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Panic rose like a tidal wave. He paced the hallway, torn between the urge to burst through those doors and demand answers, and the overwhelming fear of losing her forever. Nothing in his life had ever felt more out of control. Then, as if summoned by fate, she appeared. Olivia Bennett. She wasn't one of the doctors rushing in and out, but a nurse with a quiet authority that immediately commanded his attention. Calm, composed, she seemed to cut through the chaos. Her presence alone brought a sense of peace in the midst of the storm. "Mr. Stone?" she asked, her voice steady, unshaken by the turmoil around them. Olivia Bennett. I've been taking care of your mother." Her calmness was like a lifeline. Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "How is she? Is she okay?" Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment something passed between them. Her eyes softened with empathy, and she offered the one thing he hadn't known he needed: honesty. "We've stabilized her for now, but she's not out of danger. I need to run some more tests, but we'll take it one step at a time." He nodded, unable to say anything more. His mother was still alive, barely, and yet he knew he would need her. This woman, Olivia, who had managed to hold it all together when he couldn't. She was a reminder of something he had forgotten: humanity. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir inside him, something he couldn't name, but knew was too important to ignore. And that's when everything began to change. The days after his mother's near-death experience were a blur. Alexander found himself at the hospital more than he expected, watching Olivia move through the corridors with a quiet confidence that unsettled him. There was something about her professionalism, her calm in the face of crisis, that drew him in. It was as if she had unlocked something inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. But he wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. His mother was recovering slowly, but the worry never left him. Her fragile health shadowed his every step, forcing him to confront the emotional walls he had built over the years. He feared what might happen if they collapsed entirely. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the storm came. Sitting at his desk, Alexander's thoughts kept drifting back to Olivia, her unwavering determination. She was just a nurse, nothing more. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that she saw him as a man, not a symbol of wealth and power. His phone buzzed, dragging him from his thoughts. A text from Melissa, his ex-fiancée. "We need to talk." His heart sank. He hadn't heard from her in months, not since she had left him for his best friend, Tom. The betrayal still stung, reopening like a fresh wound every time she reached out. But something about this message felt different, inevitable. He dialed her number. "Alexander," her voice came through, familiar yet distant. "We need to talk. It's about Tom." His stomach tightened. What about him? There was a long pause before she spoke. "He's not doing well. I thought maybe you could help him. He's your best friend?" It wasn't Tom's well-being that troubled him. It was that Melissa was still asking him for help, as if nothing had changed. As if the betrayal didn't matter. She wanted him to return to a life he had already left behind. A hollow life that no longer fit him. "I'm sorry, Melissa," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "But I'm not the person to help him. Not anymore." "Please," she pleaded. "I know things ended badly, but we can still be friends. You owe it to him." Frustration rose in him. "I don't owe you or him anything. You left me for him, remember?" Her silence spoke volumes. Alexander could feel the weight of the words he had never allowed her to hear before, the raw pain, the betrayal. He wasn't the same man who would have forgiven her. That man was gone. "I never wanted to hurt you, Alexander," she whispered, voice trembling. "I thought I was making the right choice." "You weren't," he replied, his voice low. "And neither was I. I've learned a lot since then. I'm not the man I used to be." The silence was deafening. Alexander felt the walls he had built around his heart rising again, not just to protect himself from Melissa, but to shield himself from everything, especially the feelings that had started to resurface for Olivia. "I need to go," he said, his voice final. Without waiting for a response, he ended the call. Leaning back in his chair, the weight of the conversation settled over him like a storm cloud. Rejecting Melissa's request was more than just rejecting the past. It was rejecting the possibility of moving forward with anyone. He had pushed everyone away, even those who had never hurt him. And now, he was pushing Olivia away too. That evening, Alexander found himself back at the hospital, drawn there by something he couldn't name. The quiet hallway, the sterile smell. It all felt too familiar. When he reached his mother's room, he paused. Olivia was inside, speaking softly to his mother. Her voice, gentle and soothing, was a stark contrast to the harsh words he had exchanged with Melissa earlier. As he reached for the door, it opened. Olivia stepped out, her eyes meeting his. "Mr. Stone," she said calmly, "your mother's resting now. We're keeping a close eye on her." He nodded, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you." For everything. She smiled, warmth in her eyes. It's my job, but I'll always do my best. Her words struck something deep inside him, something he couldn't explain. She made him feel vulnerable, a feeling he had avoided for years. But he wasn't ready to let his walls fall, not yet. The following days blurred together, filled with hospital visits and restless nights. His mind kept returning to Olivia the way she saw him, not as a billionaire, but simply as a son desperate to save his mother. Unlike everyone else, she didn't treat him as a means to an end. It wasn't until he returned home that the weight of the past hit him. Years spent running from his emotions, hiding behind the empire he had built. He had never asked himself what he truly wanted. The next evening, a knock at his door startled him. Standing there was Lila, his former assistant. "Lila?" he asked, confusion thick in his voice. She hesitated before speaking. "There's something you need to know, Alexander. Something I should have told you long ago." His chest tightened. "What is it?" "Your daughter, she needs you," Lila said, her words cutting through him like a knife. His world tilted. His breath caught. Daughter? He didn't have a daughter or so, he thought. And that was when he realized what truly mattered. But the journey toward understanding would be anything but simple. The days that followed Lila's revelation were a blur of disbelief and confusion. Alexander had always thought his life was neatly ordered, each piece in place, with no room for surprises. But a daughter? A child he never knew existed? It felt like an intrusion, like the past he'd locked away had come rushing back to haunt him. His world, once firmly within his control, was now unrecognizable. The first thing he did was track down Lila, but she had disappeared. The woman who had kept this secret from him for years was gone, leaving him with only the barest of details: his daughter's name, her age, and the fact that she was living in a small town outside the city with her mother. For days, Alexander couldn't bring himself to go. He was torn between a desperate need to meet her and an overwhelming fear of what it might mean. Could he even be a father? He had never thought he'd have children. His own experience with love had left him too scarred, too cautious to ever imagine anything as fragile as fatherhood. How could he open his heart to this child when he had so carefully built walls to protect himself from pain? But then, something unexpected happened. Olivia reached out to him. It wasn't a call or a message about his mother's health. It was a simple text, asking if he was okay. The message was as warm as it was straightforward, with no agenda. "Is everything all right?" it read. "I've been thinking about you." For the first time in what felt like years, Alexander didn't hesitate. He reached out to her, pouring out his confusion and guilt. He told her about Lila's visit, about the daughter he didn't know existed, and about the choices he now had to face. Olivia listened quietly, never interrupting, and when he finished, there was a silence that hung between them, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but full of unspoken understanding. "You don't have to do this alone, Alexander." Olivia's voice was soft but firm. "Whatever this is, whatever you choose, you don't have to face it by yourself." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time, he understood that he didn't have to carry everything on his own. Maybe this wasn't about fixing the past, but learning how to live with it, to move forward. And Olivia, for all her professional distance, had shown him the value of human connection. A few days later, he found himself at the train station, waiting for the next train to the small town where his daughter lived. The fear in his chest was nearly suffocating. His hands were trembling as he held the ticket, his mind racing through the 100 different scenarios of how it might go. What if she didn't want him? What if she blamed him for not being there? The shame of all the years he had missed haunted him, but there was no turning back now. As the train pulled away, he thought about the walls he had spent so many years building, how they had kept the world at arm's length, but they had also kept him from everything he might have loved, everything he could still love. The journey to this moment had taken him through pain, regret, and mistakes, but it was also a journey towards something better. He could feel the weight of that truth, heavy but promising. Olivia's voice echoed in his mind. You don't have to do this alone. And for the first time in years, Alexander realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. But the hardest test was still ahead. The small town was a far cry from the world Alexander knew. It felt foreign to him, quiet, humble, and untouched by the constant buzz of power and money. He stood on the edge of the platform, the train now a distant hum in his ears. His heart raced as he walked through the town, searching for the address Lila had given him, each step carrying him closer to something he wasn't sure he was ready for. When he finally reached the house, it looked nothing like the grandiose buildings of his own life. It was modest, a simple home with a garden that was overgrown, as if the world here moved at a slower pace. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. A woman opened the door. She was in her mid-30s, with kind eyes that had aged far too quickly. It was Lila. She didn't smile when she saw him, but there was no judgment in her gaze, only an acknowledgement of what had been lost. "Alexander," she said softly. "She's inside." He nodded, his throat tight. The house felt smaller as he stepped inside, as if the air itself was charged with the moment he had been dreading for so long. His eyes scanned the room, settling on a young girl sitting by the window, her back to him. She looked about 10, with dark hair tied back in a ponytail, her small figure hunched over a book. The world seemed to stop as he took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. She didn't look up when he approached, but he could feel her presence, fragile, yet fierce, like a storm waiting to break. "Emily?" Lila said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl turned, her eyes locking with his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat. She had his eyes, those same piercing blue eyes that his mother had once praised. The resemblance was undeniable, and yet, in her face, there was a new fear, an uncertainty that he couldn't place. "Who are you?" Emily's voice was small, wary, as if she were waiting for him to vanish, like a dream fading in the light. Alexander's throat tightened. "Im, your father," he said, the words feeling like they didn't belong to him. They sounded foreign, as if he had no right to say them. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth settling between them. Emily stood, taking a step back, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and caution. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not. You can't be." The rejection hit harder than he'd imagined. But it wasn't just about her not accepting him. It was about all the lost years, all the moments he could never get back. "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." The silence that followed was suffocating. But then, slowly, Emily's gaze softened, just a little. She didn't speak, but the smallest nod was enough. Tears welled up in Alexander's eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. In that single, fragile moment, something inside him broke open, and just like that, everything changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days after their first meeting grew quieter, gentler. Alexander's meetings with Emily, once tense and awkward, began to shift. Slowly, she started to trust him, not completely, but enough to let him in, even if just a little. The first real breakthrough came when Emily invited him to the park. He stood by the swings, watching her approach, her nervousness evident. "Push me," she said with a shy smile, her first sign of vulnerability. As he pushed her gently, something inside him shifted. This moment wasn't about fixing everything. It was about showing up. And in that simple act, he began to realize that the years he'd lost couldn't be reclaimed, but the future was still his to shape. Later that evening, Emily turned to him with a small smile and said, "Thanks for coming today, Dad." The words struck him like a wave. "Always, Emily," he whispered. As he walked home, he realized that this was just the beginning, not just for him and Emily, but for him and the future he was beginning to build. The past had been painful, but in Emily's smile, he found hope. And with Olivia by his side, Alexander knew that love, real, unconditional love, was finally within reach. And with that, everything began to change.